My name is Allara Merritt. I'm 45. For 27 years, I served in the shadows of the U.S. Cyber Defense Command. I led operations that never made headlines. I carried the weight of secrets, watched friends fall, and bled silence to keep others safe. But the battlefield that broke me wasn't overseas, it was a courtroom. A war waged not with bullets, but with blood ties. That morning, I stood in full uniform, facing the people who raised me. Their eyes cold, their voices rehearsed. And as they tried to erase me, I reached for my most dangerous weapon, one single sheet of paper. Before we go any further, I want to know, where in the world are you hearing this from? Share it in the comments, because even if our paths are different, pain and strength sound the same everywhere. The federal courtroom in D.C. was a study in stark geometry. Clean lines, polished oak, and a quiet that felt heavier than sound. The air, thick and still, carried the faint, metallic scent of old air conditioning and nervous sweat. I stood, ramrod straight, my dress uniform a crisp line of defiance against the sterile backdrop. The metals pinned to my chest felt like lead weights, each one a testament to battles fought and won, and each one utterly meaningless in this room. My family, my mother, Eva, and my brother, Lucas, sat on the opposing side, a unified front of manufactured sorrow. Lucas spoke first, his voice practiced, a carefully modulated blend of disappointment and concern. He recounted a long list of my supposed failings, my mental instability, my obsessive secrecy, my alleged reckless spending, and finally, the theft. My theft of the one thing they claimed was sacred, the deed to our family home. Eva, my mother, nodded along, her gaze fixed on the judge, never on me. They painted a picture of a broken, paranoid woman who had lost her way after a life of secret work. They spoke of my medals, my service, as if they were evidence of my brokenness, not my strength. The judge, a man with tired eyes and a perfectly trimmed beard, listened impassively. He saw a decorated officer and two grieving family members, and the narrative they were weaving was simple, clean, and believable. What he didn't see was the truth of my silence. My military training had taught me that in a high-stakes standoff, the first person to speak often reveals their weakness. The first person to react, to plead, to explain, cedes control. So I held my ground. I didn't flinch. I let their lies hang in the air, a thick, ugly smog. Every accusation they threw at me was a grenade with a live pin, and I simply watched it land. I wasn't just standing in a courtroom, I was on patrol. Every detail mattered. The flicker of Lucas's eye when he lied about the dates, the way my mother's hand trembled when she held up a forged document. The commendation pinned neatly on my uniform, a small, polished disc of silver, was my only witness. It was for a mission where I'd gone silent for 6 months, a ghost in a foreign land. I had returned with the target neutralized, the mission a success. In this room, that medal was just a piece of metal, a symbol they chose to ignore, but for me, it was a reminder of what silence could achieve. It was a secret I kept close, a small, quiet rebellion on my chest. As Lucas droned on, his words echoing in the vast, empty space, I felt the familiar weight of being overlooked. They weren't just accusing me of stealing the house. They were accusing me of being a ghost. And in their narrative, a ghost couldn't own anything, couldn't feel anything. They were trying to erase me. The more they spoke, the more they sealed themselves inside their carefully constructed lie, not realizing I wasn't interested in fighting their truth, but in bringing my own. They had mistaken my quiet nature for a lack of courage, and my strategic silence for a lack of a defense. Their words were a performance for the judge, a cheap play with 2 mediocre actors, and I was the unsuspecting audience they assumed would break character. But I never broke. I just waited. I had learned a long time ago that you never interrupt your enemy while they are making a mistake. And they were making a catastrophic one. I simply stood there, a quiet, immovable object in the face of their loud, calculated force. But that wasn't the whole story. The beginning was so quiet, so mundane, you'd miss it if you weren't looking. My life, before the courtroom, had a steady rhythm, an understated calm. I would wake up before dawn, the streetlights still casting a yellow haze on the silent streets of my Boston suburb. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. I'd make coffee, the sharp smell a jolt of life, and watch the sun rise, painting the sky in a gentle gray and pink. My mornings were a ritual of quiet discipline, a short run, a cold shower, a review of reports for my remote consulting work. My life was a well-oiled machine, efficient and calm. This was the life I had chosen after my 2 decades of service. Not the chaotic, high-stakes life of a field operative, but a quiet, solitary existence. I valued my privacy above all else. I had learned to value silence. It was a safe place. My family, however, saw my calm as coldness, my silence as distance. My brother, Lucas, was the opposite. A charming, charismatic man who, in my estimation, was a professional life-on-fire haver. He moved from one grand scheme to another, each one more ambitious and less successful than the last. He was a master of the grand gesture, the loud proclamation. He took up all the space in a room. And my mother, Eva, lived for it. She would listen to his plans with breathless excitement, as if he were a captain of industry, not a man who was constantly on the brink of financial ruin. I remembered a Thanksgiving a few years back. The house was alive with the smell of roasting turkey and cinnamon. The family gathered around the table, and Lucas was holding court, bragging about his new side business, some venture capital thing he was getting into. He spoke about his vision, his hustle, his future. I sat there, unnoticed, sipping coffee from my favorite mug. It was chipped, a remnant from my childhood, with a faded picture of a cat on it. It was the last thing my father had given me before he passed. He knew I loved it, and even though it was cracked, it held my coffee perfectly. Lucas never noticed it, not that day, not ever. He wouldn't have understood that this simple, broken thing was more valuable than any of his half-baked schemes. It was always like this. As a child, while Lucas was being praised for learning to tie his shoes, I was quietly doing the laundry for the family. While Lucas was being celebrated for getting an A on a history test, I was making sure my dad, who was often ill, had taken his medication. My mother once said to me, with a slight frown, "You've always been distant, Allara. You don't get excited about things like your brother does." I wanted to tell her that I got excited about a perfectly laundered shirt or a father who was resting comfortably. But I knew she wouldn't understand. She only understood the language of public display, of loud celebration, of outward success. And in that world, I was always a ghost. I was the one who managed the details, who kept the engine running, while Lucas took all the credit for the journey. I was the one who made sure the bills were paid, the lights were on, the health insurance was current. The silent, invisible force that held their lives together. My silence, which had been my greatest asset in my career, became my greatest liability at home. I was a ghost. And then there was the Lucas I knew when no one else was watching. The one who called me in the middle of the night, desperate. The one who had fallen into a deep addiction in college. I was the one who pulled him out. I flew to his campus, held his head while he was sick, and quietly, without telling a soul, I paid for his rehab. I was the supply line. The one who kept the operation running, invisible. Until it was cut. I had always been there for them. A quiet support system. I had bought my parents' house for them years ago, a surprise on their anniversary, a way to ensure their financial security. I had never told anyone about it. It wasn't for praise, it was simply a thing that needed to be done. Lucas didn't even know. Not until that night. He had no idea of the quiet sacrifices I had made for our family, because I had never once asked for credit or recognition. I was the bedrock of their lives, and they had mistaken me for a shadow. The foundation had been cracking for years, but I had refused to see it. Not until the public light of the family reunion exposed every fracture. The family reunion was held at a rented hall, a sterile, cavernous room with bad lighting and a smell of stale food. What was supposed to be a celebration of my parents' 50th wedding anniversary had morphed into a public deposition. The hall was filled with friends and extended family, all eyes on me, some curious, some openly hostile. Lucas and Eva had been preparing them for this moment for weeks, sending emails and making phone calls, carefully crafting a narrative of my instability. Lucas, ever the showman, stood up. He held a thick file in his hands. "We didn't want to do this, Allara," he said, his voice dripping with faux regret. "But you've left us no choice. This is the only way we can protect Mom and Dad." He then began to pull out a series of photographs and documents. The photographs were of me, taken without my knowledge over the past year. Me in my jogging clothes, looking tired. Me at a coffee shop, looking distant. Me staring at the ocean, looking lost. He presented them as proof of my decline. "As you can see," he said, holding up a picture of me looking contemplative, "she's not well. She's withdrawn. She's a danger to herself and to others." Then Eva stood up, her face a mask of sorrow. She pulled out the deed to the house, which had my name on it. "We found this, hidden in the safe," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "She took it from us. My own daughter. The house my parents built. Gone." The gasps from the crowd were audible. My aunts and uncles, who had known me my entire life, looked at me with a mixture of pity and revulsion. They saw a woman who had betrayed her family, a daughter who had stolen from her parents. They didn't see the years I had spent bailing Lucas out of trouble, the money I had poured into their lives, the quiet sacrifices I had made. They didn't know that I had bought that house for them. It was a secret, a quiet act of love, and now it was a weapon to be used against me. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through my chest. My pulse began to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My hands, cold and slick with sweat, were balled into fists. My throat felt dry, a hollow canyon. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that courses through your veins when a mission goes sideways. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the deed from her hands and tear it in half. I wanted to reveal every lie, every deception, every bit of their parasitic existence that had been draining me for years. But I didn't. I held it all in. I was a statue, frozen in the middle of a swirling storm. My mind, trained for combat, went into tactical mode. I saw every face, every expression, every detail. The pity in my cousin's eyes. The harsh, unforgiving glare of my mother. The self-satisfied smirk on Lucas's face. It was a frozen frame, a moment in time that would be etched into my memory forever. I saw my brother, a man I had once saved, standing there, his face a mask of deceit. And in the background, a low, buzzing hum from the fluorescent lights overhead. It was a sound that now, in my mind, would be forever linked to the moment my family chose to publicly assassinate my character. I looked at them and I saw a chasm opening up between us. A chasm filled with their lies and my silence. A chasm that could never be crossed again. The quiet, sympathetic looks of a few people in the crowd told me all I needed to know. They were not my allies. They were observers. Their pity was as useless to me as their condemnation. My brother and mother had orchestrated a perfect crime, using my own strength against me. My privacy was a cover, my reputation a tool, and my generosity was a weapon they had turned on me. In their eyes, I was not a person with feelings, but a resource to be plundered. And now that they had what they wanted, they were trying to dispose of me, publicly and definitively. And then I simply turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a soldier leaving a battlefield. I stepped out of the hall and into the cool, dark night, and I could still hear the faint echo of their laughter, a final, cruel flourish to their performance. The sound followed me, a ghost in the humid night air. I drove for hours, the humid Boston night air rushing through the open window, a desperate attempt to wash away the feeling of violation. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the echo of their laughter clung to me like a second skin. It wasn't the public humiliation that was the most painful thing. It was the realization. The slow, creeping understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a premeditated act. The betrayal wasn't a sudden event, but a slow poison. They had been working at it for years, a quiet, insidious project to drain me of my resources and then discard me. The final, undeniable proof came in an email, a generic alert that pinged my phone while I was stopped at a red light. The sender was an anonymous veterans relief organization. The subject line was disbursement of veteran funds. The contents were a simple, transactional confirmation. A wire transfer of $5,000 had been sent to a bank account in my name. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I had never applied for veteran relief funds. Not once. I had always been fiercely independent, proud of the fact that I had never had to rely on anyone, least of all a charity. I scrolled down and I saw the name of the bank. It wasn't mine. It was a bank I didn't even recognize. My heart, which had been racing since I left the hall, finally fell, landing with a sickening thud in the pit of my stomach. The email wasn't for me. It was for a bank account that had been opened in my name, a ghost account. And the money was from a Veterans Relief Fund, a fund meant for disabled and struggling soldiers. The dots began to connect, forming a constellation of betrayal so vast and complex it made my head spin. The stolen deed, the accusations of instability, the ghost account. It wasn't just about the house. It was about my identity, my service, my legacy. They had been using me. My military record, my stellar reputation, my silence. They had been using it all as a blueprint for infiltration. They had used my name to open bank accounts, to apply for relief funds, to gain access to confidential information. My life wasn't just a quiet existence. It was a ghost trail, a digital shadow that they were using to cover their tracks. I had always been so careful, so meticulous about my digital footprint. But they had found a way to weaponize my good name, my hard-earned credibility. They had turned my legacy of service into a tool for their own selfish, criminal gain. I pulled over to the side of the road, the car a small, metal box of grief and fury. The silence in the car was deafening. It was a different kind of silence than the one I had cultivated. This was a silence that was heavy, suffocating. The silence of absolute finality. The trust was gone. It had been eroded, bit by bit, for years, and now, with this one email, it had completely collapsed. I thought about all the times I had seen Lucas bragging about his side business, his voice filled with a hollow bravado. I thought about my mother, who had always worried about my career, my secrecy, who had always preferred Lucas's loud, reckless charisma to my quiet strength. I saw now that their preference wasn't about love. It was about opportunity. They saw my silence, my discipline, my quiet success, not as something to be proud of, but as something to exploit. The wounds they left weren't visible. They were systemic. They were viral. They had infected every part of my life, from my bank account to my reputation, to my own sense of self. They had not just stolen a deed, they had stolen my name, my sacrifice, my years of service. The grief was a physical weight, a crushing force that threatened to break me. I felt the tears welling up in my eyes, hot and sharp, but I didn't let them fall. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I wouldn't crumble. Not now. Not ever. I had a war to fight. And this time, I was fighting it not with secrets and silence, but with quiet, methodical, and devastating truth. I wiped my face on the back of my hand, a silent vow passing through my mind. So I began to watch and wait. My strategy was simple, born of years in the field. Don't confront. Don't accuse. Just observe. Let them talk, let them move, and they will always, eventually, show you their hand. The digital trail was a map, and I was an expert cartographer. I began to track the money from the Veterans Relief Fund. It didn't go to my ghost account, not really. It went through a series of shell companies, each one a dead end, until I saw a pattern. They all funneled into a single corporation, Arvos International. The name meant nothing to me at first. It was just a name, a digital ghost. But I used my old network, a few trusted sources who still owed me favors, and I found out what Arvos International really was. It was a shell company, a front for a vast, illegal operation. A data siphon. They were collecting information, military clearance data, veteran identities, credit information, and selling it on the black market. The twist, the one small, fatal detail, came when I looked at the company's registration. The CEO was listed as a man named Arthur V. Arvos. A made-up name. But the address listed for the company was an old P.O. box in a city where my mother's therapy clinic, a small business she had opened just 2 years ago, was located. Her clinic, I now knew, was the front for the operation. It wasn't a clinic at all. It was a data farm. A way for them to meet with their victims under the guise of therapy, all the while stealing their information. I had always been their silent partner, their supply line. I had been their proof of concept. They had used my identity, my service record, my name, to build a blueprint for infiltration. They had used my life as a template for their crimes. My military commendation wasn't just a symbol of my service, it was a key. It was proof that a quiet, unassuming veteran with a spotless record was a perfect target. My investigation went deeper. I found encrypted emails between my brother and a third party discussing the logistics of the data sale. I found receipts for the printing of forged documents. I found a complex web of lies and deceit that went far beyond a single house deed. My brother and mother were not just petty criminals. They were cogs in a larger, more sinister machine. Their grand scam wasn't about a house. It was about something far larger, far more dangerous. They were not just criminals. They were a systemic threat. The next time I stood in that courtroom, I didn't have to say a word. I simply presented a single, neatly printed document to the judge. It was a single page, a summary of my findings, a map of the digital trail. It showed the connection between the stolen deed, the forged Veterans Relief Funds, the shell companies, Arvos International, and my mother's therapy clinic. The paper was a quiet, unassuming thing, but it contained a universe of truth. The judge, a man who had seen everything, read the document. His eyes widened slightly. He looked at me, a long, searching gaze, and then at Lucas and Eva. He didn't say a word. He simply pressed a button on his desk. The doors to the courtroom were sealed shut. Lucas's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, began to crumble. He looked at my mother, then at me. His eyes, for the first time in my life, held no charm, no bravado. Just fear. I watched as his carefully constructed facade fell apart, piece by piece. He whispered a single, defeated line. They made me. I didn't need to ask who they were. I knew. His accomplices. The ones who had given him the idea, the ones who had helped him set up the operation. But his excuse, his last attempt at self-preservation, was a testament to his character. He was a coward. And in that moment, in that quiet, sealed room, his confession was a gift. It was the final piece of the puzzle. They had used my service record as a blueprint for infiltration. And now, they had been infiltrated themselves. The same silence they had taken for weakness had become my ultimate weapon. From that moment, the balance was mine. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal motions, federal investigations, and quiet conversations with people I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't get my day in the press. I didn't get to stand on a podium and tell my story to the world. And I didn't want to. My revenge was a quiet, methodical process, a strategic withdrawal from the battlefield. I moved out of the city. I found a small house on the coast of Maine, a quiet, unassuming place with a view of the ocean. The house was simple, elegant, and it was entirely mine. I began to build a new life, a life on my own terms. I cut ties with my family, not with anger or a loud confrontation, but with a silent, final closing of the door. There were no emotional goodbyes, no tearful phone calls. Just a slow, deliberate removal from their lives. The silence that had once defined my relationship with them now became the ultimate symbol of my liberation. It was a silence that said, "You no longer have access to me, to my life, to my strength." My recovery was a process of rediscovering myself. I started running again, not to escape, but to build. The cold, crisp air of the Maine coast filled my lungs, and my feet pounded a steady, rhythmic cadence on the pavement. I learned to garden, my hands in the dirt, the simple act of growing something new, a profound act of healing. I started working again, but this time, my work was different. I used the quiet influence I still had, the network of old friends and colleagues, to start something new. I called it the Sentinel Foundation. It was a pro bono legal defense fund for veterans. We didn't do press. We didn't do PR. We just did the work. We found veterans who had been taken advantage of, who had been preyed upon by criminals, and we helped them. We helped them find their way back. It was a way for me to turn the pain of my own betrayal into a source of strength for others. It was my way of ensuring that no other veteran had to walk through the fire alone. My stance changed. My gaze, which had always been so guarded, so watchful, became open. I had nothing to hide, nothing to prove. My life was my own again. The quiet life I had always led was no longer a sign of my distance, but a testament to my peace. I no longer had to constantly be on guard. The surveillance was over. The war was won. My life was no longer defined by their lies, but by my truth. I was no longer a ghost in my own family's narrative. I was the architect of my own life. I was not rebuilding to prove anything to anyone. I was rebuilding because I could. And in that simple, powerful truth, there was a quiet, unshakable strength. There was still one last chapter to close. The final chapter was a small, quiet piece of news that I learned about through my work. Lucas and Eva had been arrested, not just for identity theft and fraud, but for a much larger, more complex series of crimes tied to Arvos International. The same people who had given them the blueprint had also turned on them. They were serving time, their grand scheme shattered, their lies finally catching up to them. Their natural consequences. I felt no satisfaction, no joy. Only a quiet sense of finality. The war was over. And the victory was not a celebration, but a stillness. A deep, abiding peace. The quietest moments are the most profound. My final chapter isn't a victory parade. It's a Tuesday morning. I'm sitting by my window in my small house in Maine. The sun is just starting to rise, and the light is a beautiful, dusty gold, painting the quiet ocean. The air is cold and clean, and the only sound is the rhythmic, gentle crash of the waves on the shore. I'm holding a new mug, a simple white ceramic one, filled with coffee. It doesn't have a picture of a cat on it, and it isn't chipped. It's just a mug. A quiet, sturdy, unremarkable thing. I think back to that courtroom. The fluorescent lights humming. The weight of my commendation. The silence. I see now that the silence wasn't a punishment. It was a shield. The commendation wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a testament to my resilience. And the hum of those lights, which had once felt so suffocating, is now just a distant memory. A signpost on the road I traveled. I'm not rebuilding to prove anything. I'm rebuilding because I can. And in that simple, powerful truth, there is a quiet, unshakable strength. Healing isn't about bitterness. It's about growth. It's about choosing not to carry the weight of someone else's lies. It's about learning to trust yourself, even when no one else does. It's about finding peace not in the absence of conflict, but in the knowledge that you have the power to walk away from it, to build something new. The best revenge is a life lived so truthfully, so beautifully, that their lies can't even begin to touch it. Have you found your way back from betrayal? If you've ever walked through something like this, tell me your story in the comments. I read them all, and someone out there needs to hear what you've survived. And if you want more stories that remind you you're not alone, stay here with me for the next one.